Hello everybody, here we are in week 13. Can you believe that Thanksgiving is next week? My goodness. So we'll have our traditional week in review. We'll look back at week 12, talk a little bit about performance assessment, look at non-traditional assessments or talk about them a little bit, and then we'll take a look at our week 13 expectations. So here we go. So looking back at last week's discussions, I think all of you are on track to have great assignments as you begin looking towards wrapping up your projects for this class and thinking about how you might need to implement it for future use if you are actually doing this for a client, for your own context, or for your own classroom. But I just wanted to say that I think I have maybe one group left to give individual feedback to, but everyone has done an excellent job trying to frame and think about what it is their assessments need to do in order to achieve the objective and task that you set earlier in the class. I know some of you are working on resubmits. I've already given back grades for anybody who has resubmitted their assignments that I graded last week. So those are posted with feedback. And I know that I just wanted to give a heads up in case you had not noticed. We have a few students who are going to be out this week, or at least with limited connectivity. So you may not see a lot of traffic on the message boards from those students. That said, this week could have an interesting discussion as we start talking about alternative assessments and non-traditional assessments. So I hope that you'll be able to participate in those discussions either when you return from a trip, if you're watching this later, or even as this week continues. Okay, so this week, I've got two articles for you to review. One is actually provided within eCollege itself. The other is a link out to a website. The first one is an article from Tech Trends, Performance Assessment Design Principles Gleaned from Constructivist Learning Theory, Part 2, from Thomas Zane. This is an article that kind of goes over some of what you may think to be common sense, but also just things to think about as you're building your performance assessments. So on the screen here, I have for you three main principles from this article. So making sure that you identify contextual components of a task. So you took your task, you've turned it into objectives, and now you're looking at how to build an assessment. So when you're thinking about how to build a performance assessment and you want to make sure that you build a good, solid assessment, identifying the contextual components. And we've talked about the importance of context in the past. It's no different when it comes to your assessment. How and where do you want them to perform this task? What are the elements that feed into it? And then you also want to make sure that you determine the nature of the problem and how to structure it. Should it be ill-structured and very, not necessarily loose, but ill-formed so that the learner has to fill in the gaps? Or should it be very strongly structured, have a very good support system so that it's closer to a traditional assessment? And then lastly, thinking about those task parameters, how long, where, and what else might be involved. The fourth bullet item on the screen regarding rubrics is also included in this article, and I mention this because rubrics are important. Rubrics tell learners where they're going and how they're going to get there. So if you provide a rubric for an assessment up front, it gives the learner the ability to determine, okay, what is my obligation and how do I know that I'm going to succeed at completing this assessment? So the actual citation for this article is at the bottom of the screen here, and this link is provided in eCollege. So if you're looking at the course menu, you click on W12 to 13 assessments, and then scroll down to the second week and look at the 6 items that are listed there. Item number 3 is the link to this article. So let's turn our focus to non-traditional assessments. I think many of you are finding that in your specific context, a non-traditional assessment could be quite useful. And there are those of you who may find that because you're in a specific situation, like a K-12 classroom, that traditional assessments are in order, especially if you're trying to tie your learning instructional intervention or this instruction you're creating to an end-of-the-year test or some district requirement. That said, I do want to focus a little bit on the non-traditional assessments. And I hope that some of you won't mind if I refer to specific projects. For example, Sean has a very interesting project working with World War I planes in a museum. And he's decided to take a simulation game type assessment. For his audience, for his context, that is wonderfully appropriate for the learner, for the content that's going to be displayed, and it's a bit of an experiment, and I totally approve of that as an experienced instructional designer. We have another situation where you might be developing training that's going to be deployed in an environment that you're not going to track. And I can think of at least 3 projects out there that fit this requirement. You're going to be developing this training, you're going to put it out there, and you may or may not ever get to come back to it. You may not get to collect data off of it. You won't actually be evaluating your learners' progress. So you need to think about these non-traditional assessments that can fit your need for both your content and for your users. If you take a look at the link that's on the course overview, look at the second week again like I mentioned before. This time it's bullet number 4, read non-traditional teaching and learning strategies. This is a website from Montana State University, and if you kind of get about a third of the way down the page, there's a great section on strategies that talk about case-based learning, concept mapping, discussion questions, debate, traditional quizzes and exams, the jigsaw approach or technique, and then also using peer instruction. I'm a big fan of peer instruction because the students actually have to go through the content themselves in order to teach another student what they've learned and what the content is. The page also talks a little bit about problem-based learning, which is a big area of the field of instructional technology and educational communications. So these are all great ideas for you to think about in terms of non-traditional assessments. And I want to reiterate this last point on the screen. Don't be afraid to experiment. The beautiful part about instructional design is that it is iterative. If you decide to try something this time and it doesn't work that well, tweak it based on the evaluation, change it for the next implementation, and see how that works. So let's take a look at what you're working on this week. Week 13, expectations. So you're going to finish up reading chapter 6 from Smith and Reagan if you haven't already. You want to take a look at the 2 articles that I've mentioned that are posted in eCollege. And then you want to respond to the non-traditional assessments discussion prompts. You're always welcome to go back to a previous thread and post your thoughts or responses if I've posted something since the last time you looked at it. And then make sure that you post your assessment item specification to the Dropbox by November 30th. Remember, we did extend that deadline. I will try to take a look this week at the Dropbox, so if I notice that you've submitted your assignment already, I'll get in there and try to get it graded and get you some feedback sooner rather than later. If you have any questions about building out your assessments, just let me know. Otherwise, have a great week.